Smuggled 989.
Welcome to 989 on Health, where you don't need years of university to understand the latest news about health and related subjects. As always, we've created a list of helpful links on today's topic at our website, level989.com, and those same links should also be visible in your podcast playing app of choice.
An important announcement for our listeners. This podcast is intended to be an informal tool for laymen and practitioners alike to hear our viewpoints on health and wellness. Don't rely on the information in this podcast as an alternative to medical advice from your doctor or other professional healthcare provider. For the full disclaimer, please see our website.
I'm Mike Davalos, just a guy, your average Joe, and I'm joined by the opposite of average, Brandon Weintraub, a primary care physician. Good morning, Brandon.
Good morning, Mike.
Our topic for today is vaccination. This should be a quick and easy topic that no one in the world would find controversial, right? I mean, this is science. Vaccination should be no more a political topic than just picking two things at random here. Climate change or the theory of evolution. Wait a minute. Is this becoming a political podcast, Brandon?
No, this is going to remain a podcast about health. But there are non-political issues, health included, that are important enough that they become tangled up in the platforms of major political parties. For example, voters sometimes decide for or against a politician based on their stance on climate change. But the politician's stance doesn't change the statistics and available research. You and I will focus, as much as we can, on the facts.
That's good to hear, because I'm really not interested in politics. Now, people have been trying to develop vaccines for hundreds of years, but the fact that they didn't have the proper equipment really made things difficult. The microscope wasn't even invented until the 17th century. That didn't stop people from trying, and they even had some pretty good ideas. Now, I'm not kowtowing to China just because of your focus on Chinese medicine, but just a pro tip for everyone. If you're ever on Jeopardy, and Alex Trebek tells you the earliest known invention of X was in this country, you can't go wrong with, what is China, Alex? There are records in China dating back centuries, as far back as the 10th century, in fact, that refer to inoculation against smallpox. But early inoculations were hit and miss. They might do nothing, they might protect you, they might kill you by giving you the disease they were trying to protect you from. Brandon, can you explain, briefly, why these early attempts were all so iffy?
It all boils down to what vaccination really is. At its core, every vaccine is nothing more than a weakened, mostly inactive, or less virulent strain of the disease we're hoping to prevent. Initially, there wasn't any understanding of the microscopic organisms playing such a vital role in severe illness. Instead, practitioners of the time noticed that once someone contracted, and survived, an illness like smallpox, they would never come down with it again. In China, survivors were often called upon to take care of the actively ill. In India, there were occasionally outbreaks of disease which showed similar symptoms, but some of which were less severe than others. And it was noticed that if people were exposed to the less intense version of the illness, they were protected from the more deadly versions as well. What this means is that although modern vaccines are tested, retested, and then carefully monitored to do as little damage to the human body as possible, the original versions of vaccination just meant taking a fully active strain of the illness, hopefully a less deadly variant, but not always, and introducing it to a susceptible patient in the hopes that they would survive. This was not, as I'm sure you can imagine, the safest way to create immunity.
We need to recognize they were all doing their best based on their observations, which were actually pretty sound. Since even the wisest men and women throughout human history really had no idea how people got sick, or how they got well for that matter, it makes sense that sometimes their approaches did more harm than good, and it was often quite the trial by fire just to survive and recover. As with a lot of inventions and discoveries, it's tricky to pin down exactly who invented something first, since as soon as technology reaches a vital stage that makes a new development possible, there are likely 5 or 10 like-minded people working on the same problem around the world. And in the end, it's just a matter of who publishes their research paper first or submits their patent first and gets the credit. With vaccines, it's Edward Jenner and his development of the smallpox vaccine in 1796. Smallpox was a terrible disease, and depending on your age when you caught it, you had a 30% chance of death, or even higher. Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who caught a more minor virus called cowpox would not later catch smallpox. So he began intentionally infecting patients with cowpox and observing they could no longer be infected with smallpox. I think a lot of people may already be aware of this cowpox connection, as it's pretty famous in the history of vaccines. But one thing I came across in my research is the connection to cats. Apparently, the cowpox virus is not often found in cattle, despite the name, but primarily it's found in woodland rodents, and cats catch it from the rodents and people catch it from the cats. So we may owe the history of vaccination to some barn cats lost to history. Thanks, Whiskers. Where was I? Cowpox, right. So good old Eddie Jenner notices the connection between smallpox and cowpox and cures smallpox the next day. High fives all around. Woo! Eddie, Eddie, Eddie.
Hold on. It's not quite that easy. First, we should understand why this worked at all. And to do that, I'll need to explain a few things about viruses. Primarily, how they spread and how vaccination helps us resist them. And I'll do my best to keep this as simple and brief as I can. A virus is, in the purest sense, basically made up of two things: nucleic acid, which acts as a set of instructions, and a protein coat, which surrounds and protects these instructions. Some viruses will also have a lipid membrane around the protein coat, and there are varying degrees of complexity to viruses, but the important bits are the genetic instructions and protection. Outside of a host, like the human body, viruses are actually quite inactive. They don't have more than a couple of enzymes, which means they don't perform the basic functions of a living organism. Once introduced to a host, however, things get interesting. Every virus follows the same general pattern once it finds a host cell. First, it attaches to the host cell and releases the genetic instructions it is carrying into that host cell. Next, the injected genetic material recruits the host cell's enzymes. Remember, I mentioned that a virus doesn't have a whole lot of enzymes of its own? That's because it uses the host's own enzymes when it's needed. These enzymes are utilized to create parts which are then assembled into a new virus, which then breaks free and begins the cycle again, each time they find a new host cell.
Okay, that sounds horrible. I always thought the zombie apocalypse could only happen in movies, but it sounds like a single virus cell could mutate a human into an undead monster. Why aren't viruses invading every cell in our bodies, changing and adapting until nothing human's left?
Well, remember the second part I mentioned that makes up a virus, that protein coating? Well, it turns out it isn't just a protective barrier. It also provides the means by which a virus actually invades a human cell. The protein coating can resemble a chemical or a signal that the host cell needs to accept as part of its ongoing life cycle. If the virus isn't recognized as something the cell wants or needs, it won't be able to easily invade the host cell, which means we don't have to worry about every cell in our bodies taking in viruses all at once and turning us into an inhuman monster. The cycle works something like this. While taking your sick friend some chicken soup, you're exposed to a virus when he sneezes and he doesn't cover his nose and mouth. Thanks. The virus enters through your nasal cavities and attaches itself to the cells of your nasal lining. As the cells die, they're converted to production for more viruses, and you get a runny nose. The virus is carried down the back of your throat by the mucus, and the virus gets a chance to attack the cells of your throat, causing sore throat. Once it gets into your bloodstream, the virus can go throughout your body and begins attacking your cells in muscle tissue, causing aches and pains. You won't turn into a zombie this way, but the toxins and changes to your cells can have a pretty intense effect on the human body.
Okay, but then how would vaccination help? You said earlier the vaccine is basically infecting a person with the virus you want to protect them from. Wouldn't that just mean they'd become virus soup that much sooner?
Well, the body isn't completely defenseless against things like viruses. Special cells, macrophages, antibodies, and T lymphocytes, all work together in a system that, putting it simply, can recognize invading pathogens and actively work to block and destroy those invaders before they become a fatal problem. One key element is your immune system's ability to recognize an invader and react to remove it. When a brand new virus enters your body for the first time, it takes the body a while to recognize the invader, and even more time to begin to generate the response needed to destroy that pathogen. Vaccines work by introducing small amounts of mostly inactive pathogens into the body. When the system is healthy and the virus being introduced is weakened or mostly inactive, the body can begin to mount a defense without the patient actually contracting the full-blown disease. The especially impressive thing about the immune system is that in many cases, once an external pathogen is recognized and a defense is mounted, your body will remember that pathogen and actually be able to react faster if it's ever found attempting to evade again. In the case of cowpox, the body recognized an invasion and was able to mount a defense, and then remembered the virus for future reference, And fortunately for us, the smallpox virus resembles the cowpox virus closely enough that the immune system responds to it before it becomes a significant problem.
Some names, like Edward Jenner, are well known in vaccine history, but I don't think I'd ever heard of Maurice Hillman before my research, which is a crime, because he invented vaccines for measles, mumps, hepatitis A and B, chickenpox, meningitis, pneumonia, and flu, among others. I think this is a great example of the right person, the right time, with the right technology. But I think I get what you're explaining. With vaccination, it all seems to come down to giving the patients an injection that includes either a weakened or a dead version of the actual bug you're trying to protect them from, and ideally they won't get sick at all. But they might get a bit sick now in the hopes they won't get very sick later when they encounter the full-strength bug. I think the most common vaccination is the flu shot that millions of people get every year. That's too bad, really, because that means the best-known vaccine in the world is not very impressive. I take the time every year, I'm a good little citizen, I go get a flu shot. And guess what, Mr. White Coat? Almost every year, I still get the flu! What's up with that?
This is one of those big questions, one I wished more people asked about. First, we'll need to go into a little depth about the influenza virus. There are primarily 4 types of influenza: A, B, C, and D. Types A and B are responsible for epidemics almost every winter. Type C usually causes only mild symptoms and is not generally thought to cause epidemics. Type D affects only cattle and does not infect humans as far as we know. Type A can be further broken down into 2 separate strains. Let's call them H and N. And those can then be broken down into specific strains, H1 through H18 and N1 through N11. Type B has 2 separate lineages, which can then be broken down into further strains as well.
Alright, you're throwing a lot of acronyms at me here. How about you get back to nice, relatable examples so we can all follow along a little better?
Okay, remember earlier when we discussed the body's ability to create and remember responses to specific foreign invaders? Like when exposure to cowpox allowed the body to respond to smallpox. Well, in that instance, cowpox and smallpox were similar enough that a vaccine made of one created an immunity to the other. In the case of influenza, we aren't quite as lucky. The different types and strains of influenza can be immunized against, but only if the correct strains of the virus are contained in the vaccine you're given. Modern influenza vaccines contain, usually, a cocktail of either 3 or 4 strains of influenza. Most commonly, there will be influenza A, H1N1, influenza A, H3N2, and then 1 or 2 influenza B virus strains. The trick for modern research is to select the strains of the virus which will be most active during a given season, and including those in the flu vaccine that are produced and provided for a given year's flu season. What that means to someone receiving the flu vaccine is that if the influenza strains that are active during the flu season differ from those selected for the vaccine, the body will not have the active immune response we would hope for, and the patient will still contract the virus. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, admits that the flu vaccine is only about 50 to 60% effective, which, by their definition, means that those receiving the flu vaccine are 50 to 60% less likely to contract a flu virus that results in a visit to a doctor's office or a hospital.
I guess that makes sense, but it's frustrating to get the flu shot and still get sick. It definitely gives people an excuse if they're trying to avoid getting the shot. But I heard there's some new research that's going to make getting a flu shot a lot more of a sure thing. That is, you'll be less likely to get the flu than you are now, even if you've been getting the shot every year. Can you break that down for us? Is this something I can get right now?
What you're discussing is the idea of a universal flu shot. There are essentially 2 varieties being discussed and developed right now. The first involves using a computer-modeled and artificially generated fragment of the flu virus that allows the body to react to a wider variety of influenza virus strains. The second involves creating a vaccine using a wider selection of virus strains in each vaccination. A shared problem with both these concepts is the increased cost and difficulty of creating the vaccine. The cost and time taken to synthesize enough vaccine to provide to the general public would be increased by a sizable margin. There are also studies that suggest that regular immunization to influenza strains may make a person more susceptible to a novel or a new type, different from those already known. So it's possible that, although far from definite, immunization against the flu may not be the best option for all people.
Universal vaccines really seem like the next evolution in vaccination. The one vaccine for one strain approach we've been using has saved millions of lives and is a great beginner-level start. But being able to have one vaccine that would cover all strains of flu is going to make a huge difference. I mentioned before that some folks try to find an excuse to get out of getting the flu vaccine. Some because they know they might still catch the flu, or because they might actually suffer some side effects from the vaccine itself. I want to take the first step down a treacherous road with this question, but what are some of the side effects of the flu vaccine?
This is indeed a treacherous question, and one I want to try to be clear about. First and foremost, I'll be including a number of links to various studies on our website. I'm not going to mention their results one by one, but I strongly suggest anyone that has an interest in the influenza vaccine debate, and vaccine debates in general, have a look at each one in detail. Influenza itself, depending on the strain, can have some significant, severe, and unpleasant symptoms. Things like encephalitis, which is acute swelling of the brain, seizures, even multiple sclerosis have been associated with both the strains of influenza and the vaccinations for influenza. The question you've asked is what side effects are caused directly by the vaccine, and the answer to that is a tough one. Some studies seem to indicate that flu-like symptoms are the most likely result after a flu vaccination. That means fever, runny nose, sore throat, body aches, that sort of thing. While other studies show that there's no difference between a placebo vaccination and the occurrence of flu symptoms than when an actual influenza vaccine is used. Direct causation is very difficult to scientifically prove. Studies focus more on correlation. Hey, the people who have taken this drug have a higher risk of developing muscle tremors. Than on causation. This injection caused the patient to develop a tumor. What does all that mean? It means that there does appear to be a correlation between certain symptoms and side effects and receiving the influenza vaccination. Whether these are caused by the vaccine itself or by processes related to, but not directly caused by the vaccine, remains to be seen.
One question that I've always found very telling about the safety of anything: should pregnant women get a flu shot?
As an acupuncture physician, I don't offer direct advice about whether a patient should or shouldn't receive a pharmaceutical. It isn't part of my license, and I only advise, not prescribe. And I especially try not to advise based on a wide-open question like that one. Modern research seems to suggest that the flu vaccination is safe for pregnant women during any trimester of their pregnancy. But my gut instinct and personal feelings say that it will depend on the overall state of the immune system and other overall systemic status of the mother to make the final decision whether an influenza vaccine is considered worthwhile. It is definitely in a pregnant woman's best interest not to be infected with a fully active strain of influenza, so if the efficacy of flu vaccines can be increased, my personal opinion is likely to change.
With the mention of vaccine side effects, we enter a dark and scary world of vaccine controversies. And there are a lot of theories and accusations, everything from autism to compulsory sterilization to diabetes. As long as vaccination has existed, there have been groups of people who are opposed to it for a wide variety of reasons. I think that the most well-known accusation is that vaccines can cause autism. Can you shed some light on that particular controversy? And you might need to remind us, what exactly is autism, anyway?
I'll take the easy question first, thanks very much. Autism is a term for a group of complex disorders related to brain development. These disorders are characterized by varying degrees of difficulty with social interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication issues, and repetitive behaviors. There are potential associations with intellectual disability, difficulties in motor coordination, and physical health issues like problems with sleep and gastrointestinal disturbances. And most of the obvious signs and symptoms of autism tend to emerge between the ages of 2 and 3. Now, onto the controversy. In recent years, there appears to have been a rise in the number of children being affected by autism. The precise reason for this increase isn't really known. But in 1998, a study was published in The Lancet, which is a medical journal in the United Kingdom, which associated the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, with an increased incidence of autism. More modern research, along with a retraction of the paper and the findings by most of the researchers involved, and then by The Lancet itself, seems to have debunked the theories involved in vaccination and its possible relation to the rise of autism. However, the safety of vaccinations as a whole, and the more specific correlation with the increased incidence of autism, remains prevalent. Theories abound whether vaccines are safe and involve concerns regarding things like the non-viral contents of the vaccines themselves.
One known problem with vaccines is the amount of aluminum in the mixture. Are we talking about the same aluminum you would find in a can of soda? Why do vaccines have aluminum in them, and what sort of side effects can happen as a result?
Well, aluminum is definitely a metal you'll see in everything from stainless steel to soda cans. It's generally used when a metal is desired that won't rust easily or react chemically with specific contents. In the case of vaccines, aluminum is included as, and I'm simplifying here, an irritant. When aluminum is included in a vaccine, it causes small amounts of tissue damage, which results in a more intense reaction from the body's immune system. This can result in a more powerful, longer-lasting immunity to the pathogen being immunized against. As for side effects, this type of irritation and tissue damage can be associated with redness, itching, and low-grade fever. Another more serious condition has been possibly related to aluminum use in vaccines. For more details on that condition, macrophagic myofasciitis, see the link on our website.
I read about something called vaccine overload, where giving a broad spectrum of vaccines at one time or too close together is bad for a child. Their immune system just can't handle it all. Bad things might happen as a result. It sounds reasonable enough, but is there solid evidence to support this?
While there isn't solid evidence to support the theory, there also isn't sufficient evidence to disprove it either. Most articles that mention the concept of vaccine or immune overload use very careful language to state that there's no proof that fill in the side of the argument the article was written from.
It might be easy for us to take a clinical view if no one in our own circle of family or friends has suffered severe side effects from a vaccine. But it seems from my perspective that even if there was 100% certainty that one person in 1 million was going to have a severe side effect from a vaccine, it would still be worth it to get vaccinated because these diseases kill millions of people every year. Just the flu alone killed 50 to 100 million people in the 1918 flu pandemic. So if I'm doing my math right, if one person per million had a reaction, and each of the 7 billion people on Earth was vaccinated, that's only 7,000 reactions. Not that this little example matters at all, but I'm just trying to put big numbers in some kind of perspective. As an example, according to the CDC, 55,000 people died of flu or pneumonia in 2015. And that's just those two diseases. Am I making any sense at all?
You are definitely making some sense, but I would use caution with this kind of thinking, even though it does have a rational basis. A character from one of my favorite science fiction shows once said, "The good of the many outweighs the good of the few or the one." And in some instances, this may be true, but consider if the 1 in 1 million chance were to affect you or your loved one. It's one thing to be able to make that choice consciously, and quite another when the choice isn't yours to make.
Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap it up?
Yes, and this is going to be a long one, so settle in. The debate about vaccines isn't likely to be settled tomorrow. There are two important things I think you, as an individual, need to keep in mind when you're making your own decisions about vaccinations. Number one, doctors and researchers are under a strong bias to convince you that immunizations are completely safe and vital to your well-being. This isn't just a case where they are making more money if you have a vaccination than if you don't. Vaccines are one of modern medicine's most powerful tools to help keep the population healthy. If too few people decide to be immunized, the pathogens they are trying to protect the populace from has a good chance to take hold, mutate, and once again be able to infect even those who have received a vaccine. If they convince you that vaccines are safe across the board and above reproach, the likelihood that the majority of a population will decide to get that immunization increases. Number two, there is always risk involved when you actively attempt to change your health. Whenever you take a painkiller, there's the risk of damaging your liver or kidney. Whenever you take a prescribed medication, be it pharmaceutical or herbal, there's a list of possible side effects. Even a change in your diet can potentially cause harm. While there are varying degrees of risk and varying degrees of severity in their consequences, each and every decision you make in dealing with your healthcare involves the balance of risk and benefit.
One element I think people today have lost access to over time is the personal memory of what smallpox and polio could do to a person. When I was growing up in the 1970s, my grandmother could tell my mom how horrible these things were from personal experience. We've had it so good for so long that these personal stories have all been lost or faded. So what are you getting at? Are you saying to get vaccinations? Not to get them? Are they dangerous? Are they safe?
Vaccines are pharmaceutical. They're designed to try to improve the biological systems we have and help us avoid the more severe illnesses that would otherwise be a dangerous and significant threat to our life. Smallpox is not an illness anyone wants to see prevalent again. There are pathogens that will, not maybe, not possibly, but will, cause paralysis or brain damage or death. As with anything you put into your system, there will be risks involved. And I don't think autism specifically ought to be a tipping point in the discussion of vaccines. Don't get me wrong, if vaccines are causing disease, there ought to be a focus on improving their design and removing the elements that are harmful. But that is true regardless of the side effect. As with any medication, if the benefits to the individual are more significant than the risks, there is viable reason to consider their use. Rejection out of hand becomes more dangerous than the medication itself. We shouldn't ignore the danger, but instead acknowledge it as we move forward. New painkillers are being developed that don't have the same risk of addiction and negative side effects as those that have been in use for the last 20 years. But simply stopping the use of extant painkillers isn't a viable option. They are the best Western medicine can currently provide in an ongoing process to help patients, and when used in the right circumstances, they're invaluable. Vaccines are no different. So, whether the modern research can precisely point to a yes or a no answer for a specific concern related to vaccines, I think we might as well accept that there are risks involved with vaccinations. The more important question is, how much risk is worthwhile to avoid the consequences? To keep an illness like smallpox under control, perhaps a little risk while better and safer alternatives are developed is worth it. For something like influenza, maybe the choice is a little more iffy, depending on each patient. I know that I keep up to date with my vaccinations, and I know that I generally suggest my patients do the same. I'm not going to tell you that the research is right, or wrong, or indifferent, but health is always a balancing act. Be informed, be thoughtful, and keep an open mind as new research and information becomes available.
That's all the time we have for today. These short episodes are a brief overview of very complex topics. Everything we say is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Licensed healthcare professionals should advise you and be aware of changes you're planning to make to any aspect of your healthcare. Every person's needs are different. The links to references we've made about news articles, medical studies, or other materials can be found at level989.com, along with our contact information and the complete Don't Take Medical Advice from Podcasts disclaimer. Thanks for listening, and now go health yourself.